All right, so this video is going to provide some of the background information that's going to be relevant for the readings that you're about to do, and will also be relevant for the live class that we'll have on Tuesday. And I want to start by showing a slide that's similar to what I showed before, which is we have the 50s on one side and the 60s on the other side, and I put the dividing line here somewhat paradoxically or whatever in 1965, because I think that's a tipping point where we get to more of the stuff we associate with the 60s, more of the kind of unrest and protest, and more kind of a different kind of protest, I'll say. Now, to be clear, we've been talking about a lot of protests in the case of the civil rights movement. This story that I assume you're familiar with, you just learned about Birmingham, but you've probably learned about the Montgomery bus boycott and Rosa Parks, and a lot of that stuff happened before 1965, the sit-ins and those stories. We're going to be shifting towards what happens in the late 1960s. And in this regard, I want to articulate a couple of themes. And don't even write these down if you're taking notes, just like I will be revisiting these. But we're going to see growing radicalization. We're going to be seeing increasing militancy. We're going to be seeing an emphasis on separatism at the expense of integration as a goal, and we're going to see growing emphasis on expressing racial pride, black pride. And so I'll elaborate on all of those things in a bit. Now, in order to understand this trend, I think it's worth noting that it is felt most strongly, this kind of growing radicalization and militancy, this is felt most strongly outside of the South, in the North and the West as well. And importantly here, we have to remember that more and more black people are living outside of the South by the 1960s. As a result of the great migrations of World War I and World War II, hundreds of thousands of black people have left the South. And in the North, they found that there were certain things they could do that they could never do in the South. It's much easier to vote. There isn't as rigid segregation, though, as we'll see, there's some, right? And in many ways, it's different. On the other hand, despite having these freedoms that I just described, there's still serious limitations to those freedoms. One of them is black people live very heavily in poverty outside of the South, just as they did in the South. Sometimes it's hard to find work, and if you can find work, it's often very low paying. And so therefore, the most common experience for black people living in cities is to be living in poverty. Another feature is residential segregation. Sometimes, and actually, I think as a rule, it's more rigid in the North than it is in the South. If you look at it today, at what are the 10 most segregated cities in the country, they are all in the North and not in the South. And we see that where we have black neighborhoods within cities and we have white neighborhoods within cities. Also, what starts to exacerbate this is after World War II, when suburbanization really picks up, a lot of the white folks that had been living in cities leave, and the cities become increasingly black. Another trend is police harassment and police brutality. We think of this as a modern problem, perhaps, but this is very much a deal in the 50s and 60s that black communities, have a high level of distrust for police. There's very antagonistic relationships. Unlike today, there are very few black police officers at this time, and so there's this really, tense dynamic between white police officers and black community members, and thus there's like kind of cause for resentment and grievance by black people who often are the subject of police brutality. And then here's the big point I want to get at, right? For these folks living in the North and West, the gains of the Civil Rights Movement by 1965 seem pretty hollow, right? You have the Civil Rights Act of 64 and 65, which makes segregation, kind of legalized segregation of lunch counters and places like that illegal, which enhances voting access. And that's very meaningful for people in the South, but for people in the North, that wasn't really their problem. That is, it wasn't really a problem. They could sit wherever they wanted on the bus. They could vote, but they were poor. Right? There were all these kind of informal mechanisms that controlled where they could live. They were being harassed by the police, and none of this is getting addressed. And so there's a lot of frustration, and there's a line that lots of civil rights leaders used at the time. It's, what's the point of being able to sit at the lunch counter if you can't afford a hamburger? And that's the way a lot of people feel in the North. And that helps explain why we have some really, I guess, violent expressions and really, I think, desperate expressions of anger that come out of black communities in the late 1960s. And the seminal event here is the riot in Watts. And there's debate. Some people call it Watts riot. Some people call it the Watts uprising. I'll kind of use the two terms interchangeably. I'm not trying to cast judgment either way on this as a virtuous revolution or a disorderly chaos, but regardless, there is a lot of anger coming out, and it shows up in a lot of property destruction, and then kind of a harsh backlash from the police. Now, Watts is a neighborhood in LA which had a lot of these issues: police brutality, poverty, residential segregation. The catalyst for the Watts riot is an incident of police brutality, and then the community members get really pissed. And I think really notably, the Watts riot start the day after the signing of the Civil Rights Act of 1965. And think of that juxtaposition, right? Civil Rights Act of 1965, seemingly, kind of fixing this big problem, and then you have the Watts uprising. So in Watts, there's 6 days of looting and burning. After that, the police and the National Guard come in to keep order, and you can see this image of the National Guard just kind of coming in like an army into the city. Ultimately, there are conflicts and confrontation. Of the 34 people who die in the Watts riot, the majority are black people killed by police. And what starts in Watts in 1965 and leads to scenes like this, ultimately going to spread throughout the country. If you look at this map, what it shows is where there were race riots during the summers of 1965 to 1968. Basically, depending on the color, that shows you what year it was. But here's the big point. At some point between 1965 and 1968, every major city had a riot. Right? I mean, it's almost, maybe there are a few exceptions, but basically pretty much every major city with a significant black population had one of these uprisings. And this really tells you about the mood of the late 60s as it's starting to shift. By the way, I never explained that term "burn, baby, burn." That became a sort of slogan of this. People were saying it in Watts, and this idea of let's burn it down, right? Because we're angry. And I think this provides some useful context for the main focus of what we're going to be talking about in the next video, which is this thing called Black Power. And that's a generalization. I can say if the earlier civil rights movement was defined by a nonviolent direct action and the goal of integration, the late 60s we could talk about something different, which is Black Power, and we'll talk about that next.